December 6, 1988. In a small house in Hendersonville, Tennessee, 52-year-old Roy Orbison clutches his chest as pain radiates through his body like lightning. 2 months earlier, he had been reborn, the Traveling Wilburys album shooting to the top of charts worldwide, his voice finding new audiences who discovered what Elvis Presley always knew. This quiet man from Texas possessed the greatest voice in rock and roll. "I feel alive again," he had told a friend just days before. Maybe too alive. The irony cuts deeper than the pain. After decades of singing about loneliness, Roy had finally escaped it. The supergroup with Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne had given him something he'd never experienced: true musical brotherhood. For the first time since losing his wife and children in those unspeakable tragedies of the 1960s, Roy Orbison was no longer alone. And now, as his heart fails in the darkness of a December evening, that loneliness returns with devastating finality. "My songs are about loneliness because I know it best," he had said in his last interview, his voice still carrying that otherworldly tremor that could make grown men weep. But what kind of loneliness produces art so beautiful it transcends the pain that created it? How does a man who lost everything, wife, children, career momentum, hope itself, continue to sing with a voice that suggests heaven exists? The paramedics find him collapsed beside the piano where he'd been working on new material for the Mystery Girl album. The sheet music scattered around him tells its own story. Love songs written by a man who had learned to love again. Ballads crafted by someone who believed, despite everything, that redemption was possible. His signature dark sunglasses lie on the piano bench, the shield finally unnecessary in this moment of ultimate vulnerability. When the news breaks across the music world, the tributes pour in from artists who had spent lifetimes trying to capture even a fraction of his emotional power. "Roy sang like an angel who had seen too much," Bob Dylan would later say. But the real tragedy isn't that Roy Orbison died at 52. It's that he spent most of those 52 years convinced he was meant to suffer alone, when the truth was simpler and more beautiful. He was meant to transform suffering into something that could heal the world. To understand how a shy boy from West Texas became the voice of every broken heart on earth, we must go back to the beginning, to a time when music was escape rather than profession, when singing meant joy instead of survival, and when Roy Kelton Orbison believed the future held nothing but possibilities. Vernon, Texas, 1936. The dust storms of the Great Depression have turned the sky the color of dried blood. But inside the Orbison family's modest frame house, 8-year-old Roy discovers something that will define the rest of his life: the power to make people stop talking and start listening. His father, Orby Lee, a oil field worker with calloused hands and gentle eyes, teaches his son 3 chords on a battered acoustic guitar. "Music ain't about being perfect, son," Orby says, his fingers guiding Roy's small ones across the fretboard. "It's about being honest." The family doesn't have money for formal lessons, so Roy teaches himself by listening to the radio late at night, when distant stations float across the Texas plains carrying the voices of Hank Williams, Bob Wills, and other musicians who understand that real art comes from real pain. His mother, Nadine, notices something unusual about her quiet son. When he sings, his voice carries an ache that seems impossible in someone so young. "That boy's got an old soul," she tells her husband, not realizing she's describing the gift and curse that will shape Roy's entire existence. Could their early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs and tragedies? In Roy's case, the isolation of rural Texas creates both his artistic voice and his psychological prison. The endless horizons teach him about loneliness. The harsh beauty of the landscape shows him that sadness can be sublime. He learns to find company in melody, comfort in chord progressions, friendship in the songs that pour out of local radio stations like messages from a distant, more exciting world. School is difficult for the introverted boy who already towers above his classmates and speaks in whispers when forced to speak at all. His thick glasses, a necessity due to poor vision, make him a target for bullying. And he retreats further into music as his primary form of communication. At 13, he forms his first band, the Wink Westerners, playing local venues where the audiences care more about dancing than listening. But Roy doesn't dance on stage, and even then, he stands statue still, letting his voice do all the moving. The move to Odessa when Roy turns 14 brings him closer to the emerging rockabilly scene that's transforming American music. Sun Records artists like Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins are proving that country boys with unusual voices can conquer the world. And Roy begins to believe that his own strange gift might be marketable. He practices for hours each day, developing the multi-octave range that will eventually become his trademark, learning to control the vibrato that makes his voice shimmer like heat waves off summer asphalt. The breakthrough audition for Sun Records takes place on a sweltering Memphis afternoon in March 1956. Roy, barely 20 years old, carries his guitar case through the same doors that Elvis had walked through 2 years earlier. But where Elvis had oozed sexuality and rebellion, Roy offers something entirely different, a voice that seems to channel pain from some cosmic source. Sam Phillips listens from the control booth as this pale, quiet kid from Texas sings Ooby Dooby. But it's the B-side that stops him cold. Go! 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 Showcases Roy's developing falsetto, that impossible leap into frequencies that shouldn't be reachable by a human throat. Phillips has heard thousands of singers, but Roy's voice does something unprecedented. It makes him forget he's in a business transaction and remember why he fell in love with music in the first place. "Son," Phillips says after the session, "you don't sound like anybody else, and that's either going to make you a star or make you unemployable." The Sun Records contract launches Roy into the orbit of legends. He shares studio time with Johnny Cash, whose deep bass provides perfect counterpoint to Roy's ethereal highs. Cash, already establishing himself as country music's man in black, recognizes something kindred in the shy Texan who hides behind thick glasses. "Roy don't say much," Cash observes. Cash, but when he opens his mouth to sing, it's like he's channeling angels and demons simultaneously. Jerry Lee Lewis, the wild man of rock and roll, initially dismisses Roy as too quiet, too internal for the genre's demands. But after witnessing Roy perform Ooby Dooby at a Memphis club, Lewis revises his assessment. "That boy's got something I ain't never heard," he admits. "He don't need to set the piano on fire, his voice already burning." The comment captures something essential about Roy's approach. He achieves through stillness what others attempt through motion. The friendship with Elvis develops gradually, built on mutual respect rather than competition. Elvis, despite his global fame, seeks out Roy's opinion on songs and arrangements, recognizing in the quiet Texan a musical sophistication that his own instinctive approach sometimes lacks. They spend hours in Memphis studios, Elvis learning Roy's technique for building emotional crescendos, Roy absorbing Elvis's understanding of rhythm and phrasing. "Roy's the greatest singer in the world," Elvis tells reporters, a statement that shocks music journalists who assume it's mere Southern politeness. But Elvis means every word. In private moments between recording sessions when the cameras are off and the crowd's gone home, Elvis asks Roy to sing Crying or In Dreams, sitting perfectly still while that impossible voice fills the room. "I can make people move," Elvis confides, "but you make them feel." Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? The question becomes more complex during Roy's Monument Records years when his artistic vision finally finds proper support. Producer Fred Foster understands that Roy requires different treatment than typical rock performers. Instead of trying to manufacture excitement through arrangement, Foster builds sonic cathedrals around Roy's voice. String sections that rise and fall like architectural elements, percussion that heartbeats rather than driving, backup vocals that whisper rather than shout. The recording of Only the Lonely takes place over 3 days in Nashville, with Roy layering vocal tracks until his voice becomes a choir of isolation. Foster watches through the control room glass as Roy, alone in the vocal booth, sings each harmony line with tears streaming down his face. "He ain't acting," Foster tells the engineer. "He's remembering." The final mix contains 17 separate vocal tracks, all Roy creating a wall of loneliness so beautiful it makes heartbreak feel like a religious experience. The song's success transforms Roy from regional curiosity to international phenomenon, but fame brings pressures he's unprepared to handle. The touring schedule becomes relentless, 200 shows per year across continents, living in hotel rooms that blur together into a landscape of identical bedspreads and complementary soaps. Roy develops rituals to maintain his sanity. The same pre-show warm-up routine, the same arrangement of his dressing room, the same black clothing that allows him to disappear into shadows between songs. The European tours of the early 1960s reveal Roy's global appeal while highlighting his fundamental isolation. In London, he performs for audiences that include the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Kinks, young musicians who study his technique like scholars examining ancient texts. John Lennon describes Roy's performance of Running Scared as the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed on stage. Not scary, but so emotionally naked it made you want to look away and listen closer at the same time. Paul McCartney notices details others miss. How Roy's breathing changes before emotional peaks, how his left hand grips the microphone stand during particularly vulnerable passages, how his sunglasses hide not just his eyes but his most defenseless moments. Roy taught us that mystery could be more powerful than revelation, McCartney later explains. He showed us that you could be completely honest while remaining completely hidden. The collaborations during this period produce some of Roy's most enduring work, but they also reveal his growing need for artistic control. Unlike Elvis, who relied heavily on his band and producers, Roy develops into a complete auteur, writing, arranging, and producing his own material with obsessive attention to detail. Studio musicians describe sessions where Roy will record the same vocal line dozens of times, searching for the exact emotional color that exists in his imagination. Crying emerges from one of these perfectionist sessions. Roy working alone in the studio at 3 a.m., overdubbing harmonies while Nashville sleeps around him. The song begins as a simple ballad about lost love but evolves into something more complex. A musical representation of grief itself, complete with the denial, anger, bargaining, and acceptance that psychologists would later identify as the stages of mourning. The final version contains Roy's highest recorded note, an impossibly pure high A that seems to suspend gravity itself. Behind all that glamour was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. The answer lives in the hotel room scenes that never make it into publicity materials. Roy, after performing for thousands of adoring fans, returns to anonymous rooms where he practices guitar scales to quiet his mind. Room service trays sit untouched while he writes songs on hotel stationery, melodies that capture the particular isolation of being surrounded by love while feeling fundamentally alone. The letters he writes but never sends during this period reveal a man grappling with success that feels simultaneously earned and accidental. "Dear Claudette," one begins, "tonight I made 20,000 people cry with a song about losing you. But you're right here beside me, and I still feel like I'm losing you every day." How do you love someone who disappears into his music? The question haunts their marriage even during its happiest moments. Roy's need for artistic solitude conflicts with Claudette's need for emotional intimacy. The motorcycle rides they take through the Tennessee countryside provide temporary refuge from the pressures of fame. Claudette, fearless on her Honda, leads Roy down back roads where no one recognizes them, where they can stop at rural diners and be just another couple sharing coffee and conversation. These moments give Roy material for some of his most personal songs, not the cosmic ballads about universal heartbreak, but intimate pieces about specific moments of domestic happiness. "Oh, Pretty Woman" begins during one of these rides, Roy humming a melody while following Claudette's motorcycle through winding mountain roads. The song's famous opening riff comes to him while watching her prepare for a shopping trip. The way she moves through their bedroom, selecting clothes, checking her reflection, completely unself-conscious in her beauty. The song captures not just his attraction to her, but his amazement that someone so vibrant would choose to share her life with someone so internal. The recording session for Pretty Woman reveals Roy at his most confident and collaborative. Instead of his usual solitary perfectionism, he invites the studio musicians to contribute ideas, building the arrangement collectively while maintaining his artistic vision. The result is his most commercially successful single, but also his most musically democratic, a rare example of Roy sharing creative control without sacrificing artistic integrity. The success of Pretty Woman elevates Roy to his commercial peak, but it also marks the beginning of subtle changes in his relationship with fame. The song's ubiquity, played on every radio station, covered by countless artists, used in films and commercials, transforms it from personal expression into public property. Roy begins to experience a strange disconnection from his own creation, watching audiences sing along to words that once felt private and sacred. The British invasion of 1964 initially threatens to make Roy's style obsolete, but the Beatles' explicit admiration for his work provides unexpected validation. When they request him as their opening act for their UK tour, music industry insiders assume it's a publicity stunt, the quiet American providing contrast to the energetic Liverpool quartet. Instead, the shows reveal Roy's power to command attention through pure vocal ability, standing motionless while the Beatles bounce around behind him. George Harrison, the most musically sophisticated Beatle, spends hours with Roy discussing songwriting technique and vocal arrangement. Roy doesn't just sing songs, Harrison explains to reporters. He inhabits them completely. When he sings in dreams, he becomes the dream. When he sings crying, he becomes the tears. The friendship between the shy Texan and the introspective Beatle provides both men with rare understanding of the pressures that come with transforming private emotions into public art. The collaborative spirit of those tour days plants seeds that will bear fruit decades later, when Harrison invites Roy to join what becomes the Traveling Wilburys. But in 1964, Roy is still processing the implications of his success, still learning how to balance his need for privacy with the demands of celebrity. The British audience's sophisticated appreciation for his artistry provides validation that American audiences, often focused on his hits rather than his album cuts, sometimes miss. The creative period following the British tour produces some of Roy's most ambitious work, including the epic In Dreams, a song cycle that traces the progression from hope through disillusionment to acceptance. The 7-minute composition requires Roy to navigate multiple tempo changes and key shifts while maintaining emotional continuity, a technical and artistic challenge that few vocalists would attempt. The result is Roy's most complete artistic statement, a musical short story that functions as both entertainment and psychological case study. The domestic happiness of the mid-1960s provides Roy with material that's both more personal and more universal than his earlier work. Songs about marriage, fatherhood, and the small satisfactions of daily life balance the cosmic loneliness that had defined his earlier catalog. It's Over and Blue Bayou deal with endings and beginnings, exploring how love evolves rather than simply disappearing when relationships change. But even during this period of relative stability, Roy's music retains its essential melancholy. Close friends notice that his happiest songs contain undertones of anxiety, as if he can't quite believe that good things will last. The premonitory quality of his work during this period becomes clear only in retrospect. Roy was already singing about loss before loss found him, preparing himself and his audiences for tragedies not yet imagined. The final recording sessions before Claudette's death capture Roy at his most technically accomplished and emotionally open. His voice, now fully mature, can navigate any musical challenge while maintaining its essential vulnerability. Studio engineers describe watching him work as witnessing someone who has achieved perfect synthesis between technical mastery and emotional honesty. A singer who has learned to use every tool at his disposal in service of authentic expression. The last photograph of Roy and Claudette together shows them on their motorcycle, her arms around his waist, both smiling at something outside the camera's frame. Roy keeps this photo on his piano for the rest of his life, a reminder of happiness that was real even though it couldn't last. The image becomes a talisman during his darkest periods, proof that joy was possible even for someone whose gift was transforming sadness into beauty. June 6, 1966. The phone call comes during a recording session, Roy's voice mid-phrase when the studio manager approaches with news that changes everything. The song he was recording, a love ballad intended for Claudette, remains forever unfinished, existing only as a fragment that captures the moment before innocence ended. Studio tapes from that day record not just the interruption but Roy's immediate response. Complete silence, followed by the sound of his guitar falling to the floor. The funeral becomes a public spectacle that Roy endures rather than experiences, surrounded by mourners who knew Claudette only through his songs about her. Music industry colleagues offer condolences that feel inadequate against the magnitude of his loss. Well-meaning words that acknowledge their own inability to comprehend such devastation. Roy stands motionless at the graveside, his sunglasses hiding eyes that have seen the fundamental unfairness of existence revealed in its starkest form. The Sun Records years, 1955 to 1957, establish Roy as a significant figure in the rockabilly movement, but they also reveal the fundamental mismatch between his artistic nature and the expectations of the genre. Rockabilly demands energy, attitude, and sexual swagger, qualities that Roy possesses in his music but can't project physically. He stands motionless on stage, his dark sunglasses hiding his eyes, letting his voice carry the entire performance. Audiences don't know what to make of this strange figure who sings like an angel but moves like a statue. The move to Monument Records in 1959 provides the artistic freedom Roy needs to develop his true voice. Producer Fred Foster understands that Roy's gifts require different treatment than typical rock and roll performers. Instead of trying to make him more dynamic on stage, Foster focuses on creating sonic landscapes that complement Roy's otherworldly vocal style. The collaboration produces Only the Lonely, a song that establishes Roy as something new in popular music, a rock and roll balladeer whose emotional range defies categorization. Behind all that glamour was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. The success of Only the Lonely brings Roy international recognition, but it also typecast him as rock music's designated mourner, the artist who specializes in songs about heartbreak and isolation. While Elvis gyrates and Jerry Lee Lewis sets pianos on fire, Roy stands perfectly still and breaks hearts with the purity of his sadness. The image becomes so associated with his artistry that few people bother to ask whether the loneliness in his songs reflects the loneliness in his life. The early 1960s represent Roy's commercial and artistic peak. Songs like Crying, Running Scared, and In Dreams establish him as one of the most distinctive voices in popular music, capable of navigating complex melodies and emotional territories that would challenge opera singers. The Beatles, during their early tours, specifically request Roy as their opening act, not because they need help drawing crowds, but because they want to learn from someone they consider a master craftsman. George Harrison later describes the experience of watching Roy perform night after night. He would just stand there, barely moving, and by the end of Crying, there wouldn't be a dry eye in the house. We were trying to be rock stars. He was something else entirely. He was an artist. The recognition from his peers provides Roy with validation he's never experienced, but it also increases the pressure to maintain the impossible standard of perfection he's established for himself. The marriage to Claudette Frady in 1957 provides Roy with the closest thing to normalcy he's ever experienced. Claudette understands the demands of his career and the peculiarities of his personality, his need for solitude, his obsession with musical detail, his tendency to disappear into his own thoughts for hours at a time. She becomes not just his wife, but his anchor to the world outside music, the person who reminds him that Roy Kelton Orbison exists independently of the voice that's made him famous. Their relationship provides material for some of Roy's most personal songs, including Oh, Pretty Woman, inspired by Claudette's preparation for a shopping trip. The song becomes his biggest hit and demonstrates his ability to find profound meaning in mundane moments, to transform everyday domestic life into epic, romantic narrative. But success in the music industry comes with its own dangers, particularly for someone as psychologically fragile as Roy has become. The touring schedule of the mid-1960s pushes Roy to his physical and emotional limits. He performs nearly 200 concerts per year, traveling constantly, living out of suitcases and hotel rooms while trying to maintain the personal relationships that keep him sane. The contradiction between his public persona, the mysterious man in dark glasses who channels universal emotions, and his private reality, an increasingly exhausted and isolated individual struggling to connect with others, begins to show in his performances. Critics notice that Roy's later performances during this period carry a different quality than his earlier work. More desperate, more urgent, as if he's singing not just to his audiences but to himself, trying to convince himself that the emotions in his songs still have meaning. The dark sunglasses, originally adopted to help him see better under stage lights, become a necessary shield against the scrutiny that comes with fame and the growing sense that he's disappearing behind his own image. June 6, 1966. The date that divides Roy Orbison's life into before and after. Claudette, riding her motorcycle to meet friends, is struck and killed by a truck driver who claims he never saw her. Roy, following in his car, witnesses the accident that destroys not just his wife but his faith in the possibility that good things can last. The woman who had grounded him in reality, who had provided the emotional stability that allowed his artistic flights of fancy, is gone in an instant. The immediate aftermath of Claudette's death transforms Roy from a mysteriously melancholy performer into a genuinely tragic figure. The songs he had written about loss and heartbreak suddenly become autobiographical rather than imaginative. His performances take on a haunted quality that makes audiences uncomfortable. They came to hear beautiful sadness, not witness authentic grief. The man who had made a career out of singing about loneliness discovers what real loneliness actually feels like. Did this tragic event mark their downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? For Roy, Claudette's death doesn't create his capacity for suffering so much as provide it with unlimited material. The songs he writes during this period, sparse, haunting compositions that strip away the elaborate orchestrations of his earlier hits, reveal an artist grappling with questions that have no answers. How do you continue performing songs about love when love has been ripped away? How do you maintain hope when hope has proven to be a cruel illusion? The second tragedy strikes with the precision of divine malice. On September 14th, 1968, Roy's house in Hendersonville catches fire while he's on tour. His two sons, Roy Dwayne and Anthony, die in the blaze. The news reaches him during a performance in Birmingham, England. Witnesses later describe the moment when someone approaches the stage to whisper the news in his ear. Roy's voice breaks mid-song. His guitar falls silent, and for the first time in his career, he removes his sunglasses on stage, revealing eyes that have seen too much. The double loss, wife and children within 2 years, would destroy most people, but Roy finds a way to continue, primarily because music offers the only escape from memories too painful to bear. He throws himself into recording and touring with the desperation of someone who has learned that standing still means confronting thoughts that could drive him insane. His performances during this period are described by critics as transcendent and otherworldly. Boom. But they're really the products of a man using his art as a survival mechanism. The psychological transformation following these tragedies is profound and permanent. Roy becomes even more reclusive, more dependent on the protective barrier of his public persona. The sunglasses become essential rather than stylistic. He literally cannot bear to let people see his eyes, convinced that his grief is visible there and would make others uncomfortable. He develops rituals around performing that help him function. Specific warm-up routines, particular arrangements of his dressing room, precise timing that allows him to enter and exit venues without unnecessary human contact. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Roy, the answer becomes both yes and no simultaneously. He remarries, first to German woman Barbara Jacobs in 1969, then to teenager Barbara Wellhuner Halligan in 1970, seeking to recreate the domestic stability that Claudette had provided. But these relationships, while providing temporary comfort, cannot restore his fundamental faith in the permanence of happiness. He loves his new family, but he loves them with the constant awareness that love can be taken away without warning. His songwriting during the 1970s reflects this psychological complexity. Songs like Sweet Caroline and Too Soon to Know deal explicitly with the challenge of opening oneself to love after experiencing devastating loss. His voice, if anything, becomes more powerful during this period, richer, more controlled, capable of even greater emotional range. But the controlled perfection of his later performances lacks some of the spontaneous vulnerability that had made his early work so compelling. He has learned to manage his pain rather than transform it. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? Roy's gradual retreat from the spotlight during the late 1970s and early 1980s represents both. He continues recording and performing, but with less frequency and intensity than during his peak years. The music industry has changed around him. Punk, disco, and new wave have made his style of elaborate, emotional balladry seem outdated. Rather than attempting to modernize his sound, he chooses to preserve his artistic integrity at the cost of commercial relevance. Then, in 1988, comes the impossible. Rebirth. The Traveling Wilburys recording sessions unfold like a musical fairy tale. In Dave Stewart's garden studio, Roy sits among legends who treat him not as a relic, but as an equal. Bob Dylan cracks jokes between takes. George Harrison shares guitar riffs like secrets. Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne hang on every note Roy sings, their faces showing the same wonder that teenagers felt hearing Only the Lonely for the first time. Handle with Care pours out of them effortlessly. Roy's voice weaving between his new bandmates' harmonies like it had always belonged there. For the first time in decades, he removes his sunglasses during recording, his eyes bright with something that had been missing since 1966. Pure joy in making music with friends. The man who had spent his career standing motionless and alone is finally part of something moving and collective. The album's success astonishes everyone. MTV plays their videos, radio stations across formats embrace them. A new generation discovers Roy's voice and asks, "Who is this guy?" The Wilburys prove that great songwriting transcends eras, that authentic collaboration creates magic no amount of studio trickery can manufacture. But the gods of irony are watching. December 6th, 1988. The house in Hendersonville is silent except for the piano. Roy sits alone, not the artistic solitude he had cultivated for decades, but the accidental isolation of a man whose heart has started skipping beats. The Mystery Girl sessions have been going well, the songs flowing like they haven't in years. He's writing love songs again, not elegies. His sunglasses sit on the piano bench beside him, unnecessary in the privacy of his own home. For 2 months he's been a Wilbury, part of a brotherhood, contributor to something larger than his own pain. The transformation has been remarkable. Friends notice he laughs more, talks about future plans, seems genuinely excited about music for the first time in years. The irony is crystalline and cruel. Just as Roy Orbison learned to live without loneliness, loneliness came to claim him one last time. The sheet music for A Love So Beautiful flutters to the floor as his left hand clutches his chest. His biological heart, weakened by decades of carrying impossible emotional weight, chooses this moment to surrender. The artistic heart, the one that had survived Claudette's death, his children's funeral, and 20 years of professional exile, continues beating in the grooves of records and the memories of anyone who ever felt understood by a stranger's voice. The ultimate questions raised by Roy Orbison's life and career extend beyond music to fundamental issues about human resilience. The relationship between suffering and creativity, and the possibility of redemption after devastating loss. His story suggests that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can control how we transform those experiences into something that might help others navigate their own challenges. Contemporary music streaming data reveals the continued relevance of Roy's catalog. His songs accumulate millions of plays from listeners who weren't born when he died, proving that great art truly is timeless. The younger generation discovers in his music the same qualities that moved their parents and grandparents. The sense that someone understood their deepest emotions and found ways to make those feelings beautiful, rather than simply painful. The Roy Orbison hologram that performs at award shows and concert halls represents both progress and tragedy. Technology allows new audiences to experience his artistry, but it also emphasizes what we lost when the man behind the voice disappeared. The hologram stands perfectly still, just like Roy did, but it lacks the human presence that made that stillness so compelling. It's Roy's image and Roy's voice, but not Roy's heart. Roy Orbison achieved something that few artists manage. He created a body of work that feels both completely personal and utterly universal. Songs that seem to have been written specifically for each listener's private moments of heartbreak and hope. His voice continues to provide comfort to broken hearts around the world, proving that while the man behind the sunglasses may be gone, the emotions he captured in those recordings remain as immediate and powerful as the day they were created. The biological heart stopped beating on December 6, 1988, but the artistic heart, the one that learned to sing while the world was ending, continues its rhythm in every person who has ever felt alone and found solace in a stranger's voice. Roy Orbison died in silence, but left us the right to never be silent about our loneliness again.